I was really happy when Judy and ARC asked me to moderate this discussion because the report really speaks to several of the issues and the priorities that we're working on at iLab. And this includes what factors enable and strengthen worker voice and trade union rights. Something very close to me in my role as advisor and facilitator of strategic engagement within iLab. How do we enable effective stakeholder engagement in corporate and government and accountability initiatives? Not only just because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually really strengthens these strategies and helps to ensure the outcomes we're seeking. And then how can we support more locally led, worker-driven solutions to protect workers' rights and welfare? I was also really happy to do it because Judy and I go way back to the 90s, and we share a background in using popular education tools and community and worker organizing, something we both learned from really amazing mentors and maestras from CEDEPAC and other Mexican NGOs in the 90s. And these are principles that are really reflected in this participatory approach to this research that really prioritize the learnings and the insights and the lessons and the strategies that emerge from activists and organizers. So I really appreciate that, Judy. I'm going to turn this over to Judy now to present the report, and then we're going to hear from Shareen, Hertel, and Lance Campa, who are going to share their reflections on the findings. So rather than reading their bios, and I think many of you know Judy and Shareen and Lance for their work in this realm, I am just going to give a super brief introduction for each. So as I said, I've known Judy for over 3 decades, mostly as an activist and a campaigner from her time as the director of the International Labor Rights Forum. She's been instrumental in building and supporting multiple transnational coalitions and advocating for programs that strengthen the influence of national worker centers and independent trade unions. She's now a research professor at AU, where she heads up ARC's work on corporate accountability and worker rights. Shareen Hertel from the University of Connecticut has been a leading thinker on economic, social, and cultural rights, and has written extensively on social movements. And as we were saying, as we were preparing for this, she is the teacher and the professor and the former, the mentor in many ways for many of the people who will be in roles like mine or in organizing or in policy in the future. As is Lance Campa, who is the senior lecturer emeritus from Cornell School of Industrial Relations and has been a leading voice on trade and labor rights and transnational union organizing, and I know has shaped many of our thinking and our doing in this realm. So thank you all very much for joining this. So Judy, without further ado, I'm going to pass it to you to present what is in this amazing report.
Thank you so much, Laine, and thank you, as always, for warming up the room, as you always do, and for dating us. But the truth is, we cut our teeth on that work in Mexico. We were children at the time. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try and keep this to 20 minutes, but there's quite a lot to go over. It's a pretty broad report, and I hope people have a chance to read it at another time. Okay, great. So thank you. And I really appreciate people joining. It was good to see a lot of friends and colleagues join in the RSVPs and just coming on stream now, and people I continue to work with on these issues. So I just want to go briefly over how I'm going to go about covering all this ground. I'm going to talk a little bit about ARC and the research approach, and then I've really broken this down into 2 big sets of findings: the social movements and the policy levers. I'll look briefly at the 3 case studies, a sort of high-level summary of what came out of those, the apparel, cocoa, and seafood lessons, and then conclude with a few high-level recommendations. So really just a word about the Accountability Research Center, which I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of. It really, pulling back to my roots in popular education and learning about participatory research, participatory action research has been really hitting a sweet spot for me, because for me, my career has always been about how do you think about the partners on ground, the national actors, those local NGOs and trade unions, and how do you enable them to gain influence and power both nationally and increasingly internationally where we can. So I should say, really, thank you to ARC, and also thank you to Sarah Hogan and other people at the Packard Foundation who encouraged me to take the step back after nearly 10 years at the International Labor Rights Forum to reflect a bit on this work. So building worker power really comes out of my reflections thinking, okay, I've been helping build, and I'm still supporting a lot of these coalitions and campaigns for worker rights and global supply chains. But what are the policies and levers and mechanisms that we're creating? How are these strategies actually helping national trade unions and NGOs? And this came up a lot for me because we had so many of our partners who were coming under threat for challenging the powers that be in their country. And as much as we were using global supply chain campaigns to gain leverage for them, it still put them under threat. So it really left me asking, are we advancing their national agenda? And how are we increasing their leadership? So the research approach, as mentioned, it was really multiple long-form interviews with some amazing Global South leaders who are mentioned and quoted in the report, another 36 transnational organizers and campaigners. I really homed in on 3 networks, sort of more than campaigns: the Clean Clothes Campaign Network, the Voice Network in Cocoa, and the Seafood Working Group. All right, so from transnational advocacy networks to what I'm calling in here the transnational supply chain advocacy networks. And I'll recognize TSCAN is not the prettiest of acronyms, but it's what I came up with. And I really needed to reflect, because for those folks who have studied social movements and really looked at the Keck and Sikking work, and a lot of other people like Jonathan Fox, ARC's founder and leader, a lot of people working on social networks and social movements talked about transnational advocacy networks that were emerging from the 70s. But something happened in the 90s where, when these campaigns started to turn to corporate campaigning, they started realizing, okay, we need to create something more durable. And the industry-focused campaigns that started emerging, like the Clean Clothes Campaign Network in the 80s, the Voice Network in 2009, and the Seafood Working Group in 2013, and there are many others. These campaigns, were kind of driven to create this structure in a way by the corporations jumping countries. We had this situation early in the 80s where International Labor Rights Forum was documenting pregnancy testing in Central America. Human Rights Watch came out with pregnancy testing in Mexico. And every time you went after one issue in one country, it would come up in another. Meanwhile, there were a lot of development economists saying to countries that their gateway to industrialization was apparel, and yet nobody was addressing this problem. So the network structure became really important. The industry level. So these networks have each very distinct origins and approaches that I'll get into. And I want to just start by some of the common traits that pull them together. And that is this shared vision. And that's really changing the shared vision of changing the rules of the game to support worker voice and their representatives, and getting those workers and their representatives a seat at the table to drive change. So the TSCAN are very much at their core about organizing rights. Union organizing rights become central. Their structure is loose but durable, enabling a lot of sort of bilateral organizing as well as coalition action. Just very deep levels of trust that come from solidarity and a rapid response network. I think many people have recognized, for example, the Clean Clothes Campaign, the oldest of these 3 networks, has one of the bar none best rapid response networks for organizers in trouble. And also the willingness of these networks to evolve, to grow the leadership of Global South unions, NGOs, and farmer organizations. Finally, all of this puts together some impressive knowledge networks that I think we need now as we start talking about stakeholder engagement. So let me go back for a second and line up this broader cast of characters. This always makes me nervous being somebody from the field and then coming into academia. I always resent when academics start doing these typologies, but I had to do it because I started to really find and draw this distinction. And I think it helps clarify some of the understanding around what we mean when we talk about stakeholder engagement. There are really kind of three broad groups. There are engagers, campaigners, and organizers. And I say this having been somebody who's worked in all three sectors. I worked for SAI, a multi-stakeholder initiative. I've worked in direct care work. I've been an organizer and community organizer, worker organizer, and I've done campaigning when I was leading ILRF. So I really see a role for all of these, but I think that the engagers are often, they have an easier time connecting with government and corporate actors because they're tending towards providing services, building models, and really they're looking at incremental change and sort of the art of the possible. So in talking to corporations, what can we get corporations to do? The distinction, however, is campaigners and organizers, and this is where they come together in the T-scan, is they're really looking at building power and changing the rules of the game. Coming back to the commonalities among these campaigns, I think the trust building, and when we talk about stakeholder engagement, this becomes important because a lot of the trust building that's happening from those that are sort of outside the movement building work can seem to be a bit top down or one-off and not really enabling the kind of engagement we need to really give access to problem solving to some of the Global South actors. So just a really high level roadmap. When people look at the Clean Clothes Campaign Network or the Voice Network from the outside or the Seafood Working Group, they often see the sort of egregious abuses, the expose, because a lot of times that's how these coalitions get attention, right? In Apparel, it was about wage theft. The CCC started with storefront protests about wage theft. And then there's the gender-based violence that I mentioned and the pregnancy testing. So there was this real sense of outrage that brought a lot of people into the discussion. But always at their core goal came this: how do we map the supply chain? How do we identify the complicity of the multinationals? And then how do we enable organizing? Same for the cocoa sector. And there are a couple generations of organizing in the cocoa sector, but I think this is true across the board and certainly for the Voice Network as it goes forward. The egregious abuses around child and forced labor that were exposed in 2001 in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire came out and brought people together to pay attention to it. And it's been an uphill battle for many years to finally start to build a broader agenda that defines the duties of the multinationals and brings the farmers into the discussion. The Seafood Working Group, as much as the real push for attention to this issue came from the exposés of forced labor and murder, the advantage of the Seafood Working Group is GLJ ILRF was coming from this history of organizing in apparel and cocoa and other sectors, and really started the Seafood Working Group prior to those exposés, but very much took advantage of the trade pressure around forced labor in order to get attention to the issue. But again, always with this idea of bringing it back to long-term organizing, resources for organizing. And then you'll see at the bottom, as I go through the case studies, in order to not go into every tactic and strategy that each of these T-Scan have used, I really honed in on where they had their strengths, which in the apparel sector, clearly the Clean Clothes Campaign and the members of the Clean Clothes Campaign have been the pioneers in enforceable and binding agreements. The the Voice Network has done some really great work on due diligence, human rights due diligence frameworks, and the forced labor trade pressures and the import bans have been important to the discussion in seafood, among other policy mechanisms, of course. So let's turn to the policy mechanism discussion. And if there's time, I can come back to a little bit more on each of the campaigns. To be clear, the networks, the durability of the networks matter, because we still have a pretty yawning global governance gap. It persists despite 50 years of effort since the UN Commission on Transnational Corporations tried to gain purchase in regulating transnational corporations. And we can talk more about my use of multinational corporations, but hope springs eternal that we can use national mechanisms to hold these corporations accountable, and we can prevent them from sort of jumping borders in the way that we are concerned about in the push against that happening with the UNCTC. But the multinationals today are still the price setters. They're holding price setting power, and they're rarely held liable. So that's the core of this. And the T-SCAN have really built the case for legal reform. There's been a lot of really good academic work pushing for that legal reform, but I would say that the Global South partners and the Global North campaigners had been coming together pushing for legal reform for a very long time. And the progress here is that they've created a lot of points of leverage. Points of leverage have multiplied, so you have a lot more tools, but the challenge is accountability is really pretty much relying on civil society and the sector of civil society that is most under threat. Okay, so I have 4 diagrams, bear with me. The first one is pretty simple for those folks who are familiar with the boomerang strategy and Kekin Seking's work. Basically, transnational organizing is pretty much always strategies built along 2 axes. So where you have national protests and advocacy by NGOs and trade unions in Bangladesh pushing for change in their government, they're not having any impact. So then they turn to their international partners, and there's pressure on global North governments to pressure global South governments. And that's trade and human rights grievance mechanisms leading to trade, aid, and diplomacy mechanisms, or tactics, I'll say. So in my diagrams, the axes are the strategies, and the words inside those axes are the tactics, if you will. So this is pretty classic. And then in the 90s, the boomerang shifts, turns on its head, and you bring in the multinational corporations. So there's this push to really pressure the multinational corporations to make sure their suppliers are complying with the law and upholding worker rights. That begat voluntary codes of conduct and social auditing, and this sort of art of the possible that I was talking about. And I think it's really important to call it out. This concept of voluntary commitments that the corporations have been holding or clinging to, it's an oxymoron, and I think it's problematic. I can see where it does create some incremental change, but the push needs to continually go beyond that. So that brings us to today and the greater push on global North governments regulating their multinational corporations. And this is where you really see the T-SCAN taking shape and becoming more cohesive, where you have global South leaders informing and strategizing with global North organizations about how they advocate for stronger human rights and environmental due diligence laws. I think the Voice Network has some really important experiences around how they were able to help ensure that organizations in Ghana and Ivory Coast were engaged in the discussions around the EU due diligence laws, or the CSDDD. So the 3 arrows that I have here going from global North governments to the multinationals, and there are many more. And there's been a push for a long time, the Alien Tort Claims Act being probably the most known, of trying to figure out how to get global North governments to regulate their multinationals. But these are the 3 that are sort of most of the moment. the U.S. Tariff Act or forced labor import bans, human rights and environmental due diligence, and the legal recourse or the enforceable and binding agreements. And this is a really more complicated strategy where you still have the campaigns for worker-driven social responsibility, but this idea of having it be legally binding so that the multinationals are really held to a legal standard in a jurisdiction that governs them and then also pushes them to do what they need to do to ensure their suppliers are making change. I should say all of these strategies and tactics have just been additive. It's not like any of them have gone away. So brace yourself, but when you put them all together, it does create quite a complex table. At the same time, I think it's a helpful table when you get a sense of, I want to say it's option paralysis, but it's not option paralysis. It really is just all the different opportunities and the accountability pathways that we have for the organizers and campaigners to try and hold multinational corporations accountable. Of course, the challenge is for looking at each one of those is how are they enabling access for organizers? Which tools lead to remedy? And do we have enough mechanics? Not just lawyers, but mechanics who know how to use these tools, use these strategies and tactics in an effective campaign and organizing drive. These are not immediately answerable questions, but I think they're questions we have to keep asking ourselves. So really quickly on lessons from each of the industries, just to highlight a couple, sorry, I don't know that you can see, I don't know how to make this go away, but a couple of the specific things from the apparel experience is really, the Clean Clothes campaign comes out of a process that started in the 80s. It was a lot of volunteerism, really before the professionalization of a lot of NGOs. There was a heavy focus on the South-South learning and the knowledge, the trust they've built from the rapid response mechanism is not replicable. It's something you can only build over years. I know both Voice and Seafood Working Group are building that kind of a trust. And if you don't really invest in that, we've got your back for the Global South organizers, then you have to, you're really just engaged in a top-down stakeholder engagement process. The other thing I have to really give a shout out to is that, the Clean Clothes campaign has allowed a lot of bilateral organizing and initiatives. A lot of the really strong organizations are, Labor Behind the Label, Maquila Solidarity Network, the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, have all been working independently in parallel and also together. And the one that's been unique in this mix, it's not really in the campaign mix, is the Worker Rights Consortium, which has built a body of technical knowledge that they're able to share and support Global South actors with, which is, I think, a function that I know both Voice and Seafood Working Group are working to integrate that technical knowledge, but I think the Worker Rights Consortium has played a particularly interesting role within informing the effort to hold multinational apparel brands and buyers accountable to problems in their supply chain. So again, the highlight for the apparel sector is the enforceable brand agreements, of which there's a growing number, and they're being used increasingly creatively. And in combination, I think the GLJ ILRF case with Nachi Apparel, working with Asia Floor Wage Alliance and the Tamil Nadu Union to create the Dindigul agreement, and then use that to say, hey, wait, to Customs and Border Protection, you don't really need to have a forced labor import ban because we're addressing it. We're addressing the problems. We have this robust binding agreement. And I think combining some of those tools together is happening. But it couldn't happen if you didn't have the ability of the Tamil Nadu Union and AFWA and everyone else to learn from the experience in Bangladesh and Pakistan and elsewhere. And so really this sort of knowledge network and building on each other is important. And just a shout out, there has been no other fast response to COVID-19 than was enabled through this network of actors in the Clean Clothes campaign. So, sorry, this little, okay. Really jumping quickly to the COCO, the Voice Network. The Voice Network had to overcome what I call the COCO conundrum, which is this super fast, high level focus by industry and government under the Harkin-Engel Protocol on child labor, which was groundbreaking, but it failed to define multinational corporations' duties and created what I call this problem with the development compromise, where you have some of the more constructive initiatives, the groups building schools, the groups addressing child labor, more engaged with the government or the industry. And that means that exponentially less engaged are some of the organizations that might be critical of the governments and the industry. So really, how do you address that is becoming important. The Voice Network came on about 9 years later in 2009 to build relationships with farmer organizations, technical knowledge, a broader tent with environmental groups, really pushing to move past to a holistic suite of solutions that address community-based problems. And I already mentioned their work on the human rights due diligence. I will say, though, change is slow on the ground and remedy is a challenge. The multinationals' duties are not defined. The government's, Oxfam just did a great report, and I think Corporate Accountability Lab has done some great research on the effort to increase the farmer incomes, and corporations have not been paying the higher price that even the governments have been defining for farmers. So the third of the groups, the Seafood Working Group, I think I've already said most of this, but really the challenges for the seafood sector, as much as they started with the seafood worker organizers at the table, CIRC and Migrant Worker Rights Network, Humanity United, were all at the table in 2013 trying to figure out, okay, how do we invest in the local organizing? They've been challenged to tackle the ocean governance issues and corporate accountability, and the way they've been doing that is by building this broader tent. They have alliances with not only the labor organizers, but also environmental groups and human trafficking groups. And I think it's important to make the distinctions, because not all human rights groups are have the same approach. But again, the leadership of GLJ-ILRF on the Seafood Working Group has been to push again continually towards the enabling rights of organizing. And really the Wi-Fi at Sea campaign demanding fisher connectivity is a great example of that. So sorry, don't worry, Laine, I don't know if you're trying to get my attention, but the last slide here is just a set of conclusions, which I think are really some thoughts as far as advancing worker voice and stakeholder engagement and worker-led change. Avoiding the development compromise because it perpetuates imbalances, power imbalances. Really protecting the critics. Bennett Freeman, Nate Herman, Eric Beale have done some really important work on trying to think through what is the role of multinational corporations on challenging closing civic space. That needs to continue. Forced labor import bans and human rights and environmental due diligence laws need to lead to legal pathways to remedy. And we need more resources for organizers and campaigners and social movement building. I think the investment in social movement building has really gone the way of technical development aid. And finally, this leads to Laine's sweet spot, the stakeholder engagement. It requires resources. It's really, if you are not actively supporting the worker and community organizers to fully engage and be able to build up their knowledge and their ability to engage, you're not really driving accountability or supporting them in that engagement. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judy. That was great. And you were right on time. And really appreciate personally your efforts to actually conceptualize this evolution over time, give it both some names, but also some arrows and relationships, and then also to really sort of illustrate through the case studies, both sort of where it has been coming from in terms of this experimentation and development of these types of mechanisms and tools and advances and challenges to help build on and sort of develop the multi-levels of organizing and intervention and engagement and networking and coalition building that we need to be doing, and that different folks and different types of organizations play different roles in that, but the connectivity between that is really critical. And so I just want to thank you for that. I think it's a real contribution. And I do want to note that, and I also want to appreciate the folks in the chat who have been putting forward some questions and some comments that I think are really helpful, some of which you just touched upon towards the end. This comes from my other sweet spot on the funding question from my past and current life, both in foundation, private funding, and now in public funding, of how to understand how this is or not being resourced, and how we need to be really thinking about that. So we'll come back to that in the questions, unless Shareen and Lance, feel free to sort of pick up some of the questions as you go, but otherwise I'll be bringing them back in the second part of the session. So Shareen, I want to turn it to you as someone who's written extensively on transnational social movements and economic rights. I'm really eager to hear your response and your thoughts about how this report and some of the things that Judy is putting into our mix for both discussion and for action, how that contributes to that work. On to you.
Thank you, and I hope everyone can hear me. Just first, an enormous debt of gratitude to Judy and colleagues at American University. I know John Fox is on the call for this convening and for this work. To Laine for bringing us together, to Lance for being here, and to every single person who has already written marvelous questions in the chat. I see the depth of faces as I've scrolled through quickly to see who's online, and I think anybody in this audience could give my remarks. So I'm going to humbly say I'm giving them as a professor. But I've known Judy also 3 decades from early work in Mexico as well. And I have a number of colleagues and collaborators on the call. And so this is a few very single observations. And I'm going to come at this as someone who is trying to teach at a big public university. Gearhart, my dear colleague in our human rights program, is on the line, where there are many students who want to make change, and they may be wanting to do it as a campaigner, and they may want to do it as an engager, and they may want to do it as an organizer. And so how to build the kind of work outputs that Judy and colleagues at ARC are producing is a really transformative opportunity for really rethinking, resituating a more critical type of teaching and a more critical type of skills building with our students. And so I want to really preface that by taking the 3 questions that Laine had shared with all of us prior to convening us online. What factors enable and strengthen worker voice? I would say very quickly, and again, this is going to respond to some of the concerns and critiques raised in the chat already. I think first and foremost, coalition building, of the sort of deeply detailed coalition building that Judy has done with these stylized diagrams. The last diagram being the most intense, showing the multiplicity of ways actors engage, building those coalitions in a meaningful manner that is social movement driven, with the crowning achievement of the development of the worker-driven social responsibility paradigm emerging. Also tethering that and pushing hard in the context of the larger post-Ruggie moment on what we mean by meaningful remedy. We have an opportunity to capture that space, that policy space, and so to really embolden it by looking at paradigms like worker-driven social responsibility and meaningful remedy. So in order to do that type of strengthening and organizing, we
Shareen, you just muted yourself, or someone muted you. So actively unmute yourself. Go wind yourself back 10 seconds. And
okay, so I'll defer to Lance later, but I would say in order to do this type of coalition building, we have to embrace the idea of social movement unionism. Unions are having a moment. 2/3 of Americans believe unions are making a difference. It's higher in some polls. People in the global South have known unions make a difference, but they die for that reason. And so I think it's really, really important to step back and think about Margaret Levy's very early work, conceptual work on social movement unionism, to think about Janice Fine and Gordon and others who've really built the idea of unionizing hard to unionize spaces and places and people, and to look at this type of interplay between engagers, campaigners, and organizers as part of larger social movements. Social movements extend from reform to revolutionary predilections and aims. And I think instead of silencing or cutting each other out, we have to look for connections to build that type of social movement unionism around these issues. So really hitching our wagon to the idea of capturing and emboldening what we mean by remedy, and then really meaningfully thinking through how to build social movement unionism. The second question Laine posed to us is, how can we enable effective stakeholder engagement in corporate and government accountability? And in this case, I would step back and again look at Judy's diagram around human rights and environmental due diligence. Governments in major exporting countries are aware that this human rights due diligence is on the table, but local actors are often cut out of the process. And there's a lot of corporate capture of this process, or a deeply legalized capture. And so I want to really lift up Judy's idea of getting the mechanics in the mix. If we are going to do human rights and environmental due diligence properly, it can't be captured in the traditional MSI fashion, and it has to engage actors with multiple types of strengths. To effectively engage in stakeholder engagement around, for example, mapping what a living wage is, I can't determine that from Stores, Connecticut, New York, Boston, DC, Amsterdam. I have to engage with local actors. And this has been the real strength of the Clean Clothes campaign. So effective stakeholder engagement really means then defining roles, co-designing those mechanisms, building solid metrics, and opening space for publicly available data that can be used to meaningfully engage people in building stakeholder mechanisms for human rights and environmental due diligence that are worker-driven. Again, to toggle with that first frame. And then finally, how to support more locally driven, worker-driven solutions. Again, building networks, but building in the capacity to be flexible in the manner in which we fund those networks. A couple of folks in the chat had been very uncomfortable with the idea that human rights due diligence will be defined and managed from the global north through campaigns where there's a little subdivided funding off to those friends in the global south who we put in the grant only to get it. There needs to be a complete inversion of that paradigm, and we have to be far, far more creative. As someone who has applied for way too many grants in my lifetime, they take an inordinate amount of time, and they're often disproportionately lopsided north to south. We are simply not creative enough. Laine and I both have worked with the Ford Foundation. I've worked within the UN system. I work now in academia, where you apply to everything from the Department of Labor to the NSF to any private foundation. And we have to be very creative about the ways in which we structure those types of funding relationships. We also have to be mindful that people are putting in lots and lots of uncompensated time, and that this type of model has to build in the expertise and a value for the expertise that grassroots level people possess. I've written about this in social movement work. I'd be happy to talk with people on or offline about that, but there's a real need to lift up the cost of the care work and the due diligence information gathering that's going to be necessary for this kind of meaningful type of human rights due diligence informed social movement unionizing building. So I'm going to leave it with that and punt over to Lance, but happy to take up any of these questions in the Q&A.
Thanks so much for that, Shareen. And I think you inspired some interesting questions and comments about the social movement unionism, and what are we learning from that, and what are the strengths and what are perhaps still some of the challenges there, and appreciate you really again underscoring the sort of understanding of engaging different actors with multiple vantage points and strengths, but really privileging those that are on the front lines and that are deeply rooted in the place and in the work, including in how do we be creative in how we structure our funding, both public and private funding and movement funding, frankly. So really appreciate that. And I know it will prompt even more questions and reactions. So Lance, given that you've been involved in developing many of the points of leverage outlined in Judy's diagrams, can you comment a bit on the policy implications here? And as Judy says, particularly in that number 4, I think it was, that had multiple arrows and leverage points. Can you talk a bit about how those points of leverage add up to more power for workers, and where do you see potential, or frankly also where do you see things that we need to grapple further with? There was I will just note that there was a comment in the chat that talked about perhaps, I don't know, it was in 3 and 4, perhaps another level in there, which was the role of workers vis-a-vis suppliers through CBAs that perhaps could be made more explicit in the diagram as well. So Lance, on to you.
Okay, thanks, Laine, and thanks to the Accountability Research Center for the opportunity to participate in this event. My first comment is simply to commend Judy for producing such a rich and insightful report. It offers so much protein-rich food for thought for all of us who are involved in these issues. It adds enormously to the literature. I don't mean just academic literature, but social movement literature and action literature, if that phrase exists. In terms of strategic thinking for organizing and policy analysis and planning for future steps. I can't help also commending Judy for such a well-crafted report. As we all know, the 3 most powerful urges in human nature are sex, hunger, and the need to edit somebody else's copy. And as I went through the report, I didn't do much editing in my head because it's really well organized and well written, really effective use of triads, groups of 3, which make it easier for the reader to grasp and understand the points that are being made and the relationships and so on. Like the contrasting roles of campaigners, organizers, and engagers. And the 3 challenges that Judy lays out, the development compromise, the political context, and getting the resources needed for long-term movement building. And of course, the 3 case studies, these really, the intense drilling down into apparel, cocoa, and seafood, really made concrete the more theoretical oriented parts of the report. Now, Laine asked me to comment on the policy implications and whether the different points of leverage add up to more power for workers. First, regarding policy implications, Judy's account of developments over time in general and in the 3 case studies, the 3 areas of T-scan activity that she covers in the report, really convinced me that we're on a good track in terms of policy. Not that it's easy or without challenges and obstacles, not least the United States Supreme Court and what it's done to the alien tort actions and that sort of thing. But I think in general, it's headed in a good direction. When I started working on these issues in the 1980s, about all we had available for policy tools were ILO conventions, and this was a very arcane, remote system that very few people knew anything about. There was a new labor rights clause in the generalized system of preferences that turned out to be quite useful in some specific situations. Maybe earlier versions of the OECD guidelines, but that was about it. There was Section 307 of the Trade Act, but it was pretty much a dead letter. Nobody was really, looking at it or working on it. And Judy became a valued teammate in a cohort of people who generated myriad new instruments and mechanisms and policy venues and legal and quasi-legal venues to advance in this arena. They include and there's probably 15 or 20 noted in Judy's report. I'll just note, some of the key ones: labor chapters in trade agreements, enforceable brand agreements, the UN guiding principles, due diligence laws in Europe and in some American states, a revived Section 307 of the Trade Act to address slave labor, forced labor, consumer fraud lawsuits, compliance measures in international financial institutions. The list goes on and on. I mean, it's a whole new world compared with when we started out in this field. Now, Judy makes the really essential point that using these legal and quasi-legal mechanisms can't be just an exercise in clever lawyering. I've written dozens of complaints using various of these mechanisms, but I've written enough to know that the best complaint in the world is only as effective as the campaign that it feeds into. And there has to be this constant strategizing and calibrating. Why are we using this particular instrument and mechanism, and what does it get us on the ground? That has to be the focus of using these different policy mechanisms. My answer to the question of whether using these different points of leverage adds up to more power for workers is a qualified yes. Qualified. I'm not in the toothless school of thought that sees using these instruments and mechanisms on labor rights as exercises in futility, a waste of time, and so on. I think that in specific cases and in specific struggles, the strategic use of these instruments and mechanisms has added up to more power for workers in those specific situations to which they apply. So, complaints to the Worker Rights Consortium ultimately led to successful union organizing in Fruit of the Looms supply chain factories in Honduras. Complaints under the OECD guidelines have led to workers gaining union representation in the hotel sector in some developing countries. Tariff Act complaints have halted forced labor in some supply chain operations. Complaints under the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement and its rapid response mechanism have actually led to successful independent union organizing in some major workplaces in Mexico. Complaints under the enforceable brand agreements, notably the Bangladesh Accord. And I know Bangladesh is a mess, and I wish I could say that the Accord has solved the problem of abuses in the Bangladesh apparel industry, but we know it's more complicated from that. But the Accord and what came out of that has been a really important force, and there are many more examples. And again, I don't want to take up time just going from example to example. But to finish up, I don't want to overstate the gains either. We have some victories, but these victories are, they're usually case specific. They're episodic. They're not easily replicable or scale upable. They don't add up to systemic change to give workers more power in a global capitalist system dominated by multinational corporations. Systemic change is a longer project, and it would be too much to ask Judy to solve that problem. There's not a magic bullet. It's a matter of constant struggle. We win victories in small doses, But the important thing is to learn from our victories and from our defeats, because, let's be honest, there are plenty of defeats as well. But we learn from those, and we apply the lessons now collected in Judy's report in our work going forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lance, for that. Incredibly appreciated, particularly given your just depth and scope of your work in this, and so much of us that have learned a lot from you over the years. And I appreciate your recognition that we actually have evolved significantly over particularly the last decade, and including in the last few years, and that this is a real advancement, but this didn't also just happen, right? That this was also a really important result of the work that many here on this webinar, but also around the world, in terms of really pushing for greater accountability and recognizing that the tools and the mechanisms that existed, in the evolution towards corporate social responsibility were not just insufficient, frankly, were failing to actually ensure the outcomes they were set out to bring about, and that wasn't enough. And so the move towards the mandatory human rights diligence or other types of outcomes focused tools, but that we're in the midst of actually still trying to prove those out, and we need to continue to layer the work along these sort of multiple frameworks, I think, Judy, that you lay out. So thank you so much for that. I do want to say that, again, the chat has been really robust, so I'd like to turn to those now, and I'm not going to be able to do